I think she speaks with such eloquence on this topic, Catherine Birbalsingh, and she talks with such fearlessness, because part of the problem is we haven't had a language where we've been allowed to talk about racial integration without being accused of being racists. Do you feel that that wheel is turning now, so that we can now say, come on, we have to have a frank conversation about multiculturalism and how it doesn't always work?
No, absolutely. I think that, and that conversation needs to be had. That importance of having shared civic values, mutual obligations. And I think that without the presence of a common moral, cultural standard, it's very difficult to sustain and cultivate social cohesion, especially in a society which is as racially, ethnically and religiously diverse as ours.
Having said that, what we saw in the last few days is unacceptable.
Absolutely.
The violence. And of course, one of the mums of one of the little girls who was murdered said, don't do this in my name, don't do this in the community's name. But the point I was making, that this resentment, this simmering resentment, I think, that you can feel in some communities, how do we address it? How do you roll it back? Is it too late? Is the damage done? You go to certain of our inner cities, and it doesn't feel like Britain.
It's very difficult, but we have to remain as positive and optimistic as possible. I wouldn't be in the business of giving up, but I also understand the sentiment that we are nearing towards a very dark place, and I think we could see the disorders which are taking place in different parts of the country now. In terms of the public disorders we've seen, we have to be very firm in terms of making the point that respect for the rule of law is a cornerstone of British liberal democracy. But at the same time, politicians have to engage maturely with perfectly legitimate concerns over immigration, integration and identity.
Well, looking at the pictures here, this was outside 10 Downing Street last night, and what struck me, and of course there are some idiots here, of course there are causing a problem, it's totally unacceptable. But what struck me was the number of police officers there, how heavy-handed they were with these protesters, whatever you want to call them, agitators maybe is a better word. And yet you compare that to the footage in Harefield in Leeds, where there was Asian gangs setting fire to vehicles. The police just ran away. Can you explain that? Because maybe I'm imagining it, but that's what I see with my eyes, and that also inflames these tensions.
Well, I think it's Hare Hills in Leeds. And I think that the important point we have to make here is that our public institutions have to behave in the spirit of neutrality. And I think that also the language at times from the new Labour government, when it comes to talking about different kinds of disorder, there have been differences there in terms of the tone and the language. And I think it's very important that politicians and public institutions, such as police forces, they engage with concerns that certain groups in British society may well be the beneficiaries of preferential treatment when it comes to matters of law and order.
What do you mean about the language deployed by the new Labour government? They've only been in power 3 or 4 weeks. This is the Home Secretary you're talking about?
No, talking about the Home Secretary in particular.
Right, so if you what did she say?
So I think that her statement when it came to the Southport riots, which were primarily caused by out-of-town troublemakers, I think that her language was robust, and I think rightly so. She talked about violent thugs essentially coming into Southport and being responsible for destruction of private property and also injuring 53 police officers. While I felt that her statement on the Hare Hills riots, where police officers were attacked, a police car was flipped over, a double-decker bus was set ablaze, I felt that she almost struck a more conciliatory tone. Right. Now, the background behind that was that there were children that were removed from a Romani family. Yes. So we have to appreciate the circumstances are different. But if you issue statements on public disorder and there are differences in terms of the tone and the language, it will tap into concerns that ultimately we have a two-tiered approach when it comes to policing and managing disorders. I'm glad you used the expression about two-tier, because, of course, Suella Braverman got into a lot of trouble, didn't she, when she said there was two-tier policing over the Gaza protests, which we have in this great capital city, it seems, every Saturday. She thought it was they were being treated differently. Are we now having two-tier government? Because if the Home Secretary is saying one thing about disturbance in Southport and one thing about a disturbance just a few hundred miles away in Leeds, that's more worrying, isn't it? No, it is worrying, and I think the government has to try its best to adopt a neutral position to the best of its ability. I think that when
you should have chosen her words very carefully.
No.
She'd have been advised by civil servants what she should and shouldn't say.
No, absolutely. And I think that Sola Braverman, she's no stranger to making controversial statements, but I think that she certainly made a point there. I think that in terms of the pro-Palestine protests, and I'm someone who firmly believes in the cause of Palestinian statehood, it's very clear that we saw a great deal of anti-Semitic chanting, the displaying of pro-terror paraphernalia as well, which undermines the Palestinian cause. But I felt like the policing response when it came to those kind of disgraceful incidents was somewhat weak, truth be told.
This phrase, far-right protesters, has been bandied around willy-nilly in the last 72 hours. So much of the mainstream media just, I think, lazily reaches for that trope. Does that have any real meaning in terms of this conversation about these people here? Would you say there is such a thing as a... Do they see themselves as a far-right political movement?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to dismiss perfectly legitimate concerns over immigration integration as far-right extremism. Now, we saw in Southport, for example, a local mosque was attacked. You could say that is traditional far-right behaviour. I think that's a fair point to make. I also think in the aftermath of the Southport riots, we did see anti-Muslim conspiracy theories being peddled over the identity of the suspect, who it turns out to be a British-born teenager of Rwandan origin. Rwanda has a Muslim population of just 2%.
Yeah,
so I think that
92% Christians.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we should be very firm in terms of addressing that far-right disinformation, calling out, and far-right behaviour. But I think the mistake that we would make is dismissing millions of people in the country who have perfectly legitimate concerns over immigration and the ability of newcomers to integrate into British liberal democratic values. That's not far-right in my view.
Yeah, because I keep hearing on other radio stations, it's the English Defence League. And should the English Defence League be banned? Tricky. Look for the English Defence League. They haven't got a website. I'm not even sure the English Defence League exists as an entity anymore.
Well, I think that prescribing the English Defence League is just a sticking plaster, really, isn't it? I think that what we have to do, we have to have a political establishment that addresses those concerns over living in a two-tier society, especially when it comes to matters of law and order. We need to have a more controlled immigration system. The chances of that at the moment are very slim. If truth be told. We also have a very dysfunctional asylum system, and I think I'd make this point that the Southport suspect being of Rwandan origin, even though being born in Britain, Rwanda, as you know, has a history of extreme violence.
Well, his parents fled here after the terrible genocide.
Absolutely, and I think actually you'll see that children of refugees and asylum seekers, there's a high risk of psychiatric disorders. So I think those are the kind of things that we need to explore. We want to have a very mature conversation about preventing these kind of horrific atrocities.
There's almost a theme there.
And if we take what Catherine Birbalsingh said at the start of the show about the fact that you have to proactively bring people together, and she does it over a shared set of values, that is not going to happen under this government. That's my worry. They are too frightened to say what are the shared set of values and what are the expectations of people in order to be British.
They also know where their votes are. Labour.